Hi, everyone. Welcome to Religion and Revolt. I'm Dwayne David Paul, and I'm joined with my Religion and Revolt co-founder, Olga Marina Segura. Thank you to everyone who watched last week's video, where Olga interviewed me, and a special shout out to Stephanie Espinosa, a huge friend and supporter of our work, even before we started Religion and Revolt. Thanks for your comments. So, how you doing, Olga?
I am doing all right. I think similarly to how you mentioned in last week's episode, I'm very much feeling the end of the year. It's darker, it's colder. I'm trying to wind down a bunch of writing projects while my body's also like, don't you just want to nap and eat and just do absolutely nothing? And for the last few weeks or so, I was putting a lot of pressure on myself and kind of pushing myself to finish this book proposal for my next book in particular. And then I came across this writer who I really admire on Substack. Her name is Ayanda Stood, and she runs the Paradigm Shifts newsletter on Substack. And I felt like the universe was sending me a message to slow down because her post came into my inbox yesterday when I was feeling the most overwhelmed. And I'm paraphrasing what she's saying, but it was something about how capitalism forces us to put these expectations of productivity and creation at all times and every single day. And if you're not creating, then you're somehow not a writer or a thinker. And she mentioned how part of the work that we have to do as abolitionist thinkers in particular is to fight this urge and actually be comfortable resting. So I keep trying to repeat that and ground myself in it, even though I'm also really excited about religion and revolt planning that we're doing for 2024. So just trying to teach myself to be okay with being a writer that also relaxes and that also pauses. These pauses are just so hard, especially that time between Thanksgiving and Christmas just feels like you shouldn't be doing anything. So your body also kind of slows down. So I'm trying to actually just be present and live in that. But it's so hard. It's so hard. I am off very much that writer who's like, if I'm not producing every single moment, then I'm not a writer. And that's not true. And I'm grateful for Ayanda Stood's post on that as well.
Yeah, that's tough, man. To think about um, what's the thing that makes you a writer?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
uh like everything that we think about, these days is sort of qualitative, quantitative rather,
mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
And so just like there isn't some like output number
Right.
that's
Right.
gonna like make you a writer or like invalidate you as a writer.
Right, right. But it's hard, especially when I follow so many other Black writers who inspire me. And when I see them producing, then I'm like, you should be producing and you should be doing this. And it's like, or you could just follow what your body wants to do? But how are you doing, homie? How are you doing as well as we wind down? This is our last Religion and Revolt post of the year, too.
Yeah, I'm doing great. I think I'm like really looking forward to uh some like restoration in the last couple weeks of the year, and time with my people. And so yeah, I'm really excited about that. Really excited to do some reading for pleasure, and also some planning. um I typically I don't really typically feel like kind of New Year's pressure, this
Mhm,
sort of and like resolve to perfect all my imperfections on January 1st.
mhm.
I say that for my birthday, so like mid-March, but um no, I'll save all my angst for like March. Uh but yeah, I'm doing great, and I'm excited to just sort of like, have some time to just like think about what I want for religion and revolt in the first couple months of the year, but also like what I want for myself.
Mhm, mhm.
What I hope for myself and my desires, and sort of clarifying that stuff.
That's dope.
Um, yeah, I'm excited. So, we are doing uh, these conversations as a way to share a bit about ourselves with, folks who read and now listen to our work. And so the format that we're using And I think we're gonna like experiment and use this when we have like other folks on for these informal conversations. Is loosely like a 3+1 kind of thing. So it's three questions that we've like shared ahead of time, and then one mystery question. And obviously, you know, I'm not gonna get the drop on Olga this morning, and like we're not gonna do that to other people. But something to enjoy a bit of like spontaneity. Um,
Mhm.
and so to start, Olga, if you can tell us a bit about your background and what brought you to Religion and Revolt.
Totally. So I was born in the Dominican Republic, but grew up in New York City, came here in the early 90s. Like Dwayne, you mentioned, Brooklyn before the hipsters came. I also lived in the Bronx before folks even thought that it was really cool to kind of live in the Bronx, and went to Catholic schools my whole life and went to Fordham University, studied English and Italian, and kind of graduated college in 2011 thinking, what the hell am I going to do with an English degree and an Italian comparative literature degree? And then I had an aunt who worked at America, and I had been interviewing at this other, like an Italian law firm that I was thinking of working at as like some type of admin support. And then I visited my aunt, and she was kind of like, oh, they're looking for an editorial assistant. They want someone who preferably studied English and went to a Jesuit school. And I was like, perfect, I'll take it. I don't even care anything else. I just am tired of looking for a job. And this was in 2012, February of 2012, so almost a year after I graduated college. And so I became a quote unquote professional writer and editor in these Catholic media spaces where I suffered a lot of the expected sort of racism and misogyny that Black people face in these spaces, but also learned a lot of like really, really valid skills about editing, writing, reporting. I also started in Catholic media spaces right when Pope Francis became Pope. So this was 2013. And it was between Pope Francis starting his papacy and then the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. This kind of like created a two sort of guiding posts in my writing that I didn't fully name until 10 years later. But it was the first time I didn't study theology or philosophy in school. So this was the first time that I was reading church doctrine, that I was reading theology, that I was reading like encyclicals. And a lot of that was because Pope Francis has very much been a pope who's like, theology and the way we think about our faith shouldn't be inaccessible, right? Everyone should be able to think deeply about what it means to be spiritual and religious. And also, I was like many of us on Twitter, right? We were following this Black Lives Matter movement and following activists involved with this online campaign and seeing, all of the protests that began happening across the country. And so these two things really focused my writing on trying to figure out how Catholic social teaching interacted with a lot of the racial justice movements that we were seeing, because I was in a Catholic, mostly white Catholic American space that didn't really take the Black Lives Matter movement seriously. And they viewed this movement as an irreligious, secular thing that had no connection to faith. And to me, that just felt so absurd. As someone from the Caribbean, as someone growing up in the Bronx, someone growing up in New York City, I was like, wait a minute, this feels as Catholic as like my mother, right? As my aunt, as all these people in my neighborhoods, right? It's not people who are thinking about theology and thinking about philosophy and thinking about the sacraments. It's just like the auntie in your building who's like feeding everyone on the block, or the auntie in your building who like gives you a code if you need it. And so my writing really grew in these spaces, and I was able to interview one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement and also talk to a lot of Black Catholics who, it was this weird juxtaposition of white Catholic reporters not taking this movement seriously, but all these Black and brown Catholics who were like, oh my God, this is like revitalizing my faith in really powerful ways. So I wrote this article that eventually became my first book, Birth of a Movement, Black Lives Matter in the Catholic Church, which I wrote at the start of the pandemic when we were all in lockdown, where we were all like terrified that we were going to die, when we were all actively losing people that we really loved. And that book was born in that space, and it was born after I had really left Catholic media too. And it was once I had left Catholic media for a while, then I worked at NCR for a bit and then left NCR. And it has really been in these spaces outside of Catholic media that I have really actually felt my vocation and my writing and all these things coming together. And,
Yeah.
Religion and Revolt was born out of conversations you and I were having throughout that time, you know?
Yeah, and to sort of touch on, like, you mentioned, like, we both grew up, we both grew up Catholic. And I think, like, I don't think that a lot of folks sort of really appreciate the sort of like diversity of the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of obviously in like cultural expression, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the music that I grew up with in church was like very different than when I moved
Mm-hmm.
to New England, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And like, um, which was sometimes like no music, right? But like,
Mm-hmm.
um, that's not fair. That's not true. But whatever. But you mentioned like the sort of encyclicals of the church, and where like the sort of social encyclicals, and encyclicals are just like teaching documents of like the church, and where there is like, you know, a great focus on like labor rights
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
like any number of things, right? The environment.
Mm-hmm.
Uh did you sort of feel that disjunction when you kind of first started reading these things and you're like, oh, here's all this stuff that like I don't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily encounter in church, or and perhaps even like less so at work. I don't know, what was that like for you?
Oh yeah, it was honestly kind extremely jarring at first because I was in a very white Catholic space that had a very specific idea of what it meant to be Catholic. And it was very white, very rooted in American consciousness, right? Very rooted in what it means to go to mostly white churches and perform a mass or celebrate a mass and do all of these sacraments. And then Pope Francis comes in and he kind of completely shatters that for me because he's very much using language like, we have this throwaway culture. We have a society in which the most marginalized are ignored and treated as disposable, right? We're destroying the planet. We have a very deep ecological crisis. And for me, for a while, because I was in that white Catholic space, that was in such a contrast with the Catholicism in my own life, I felt very lost. And I thought that there was something wrong with me because this faith did not speak to me. And then Pope Francis comes in, and I'm like, wait a minute. There's nothing wrong with me. It's just I was not born in this country. My understanding of religion and spirituality is this very sort of syncretic thing that is the Caribbean, right? You have this mix of like Taino spiritual practices that then mix with colonialism, that then mix with African spiritual traditions, right? And we bring so much of that here. And then being able to read Pope Francis really grounded me in like, oh, it's less about trying to do this highbrow understanding of like pre-Vatican II, post-Vatican II, Latin rites, who can be a priest, who cannot be a priest, and more like, no, how are you organizing? How are you trying to combat these ecological crises? How are you using Catholic social teaching to fight for the rights of the most oppressed and marginalized? And so it felt very, very grounding to kind of be like, oh, I'm not the issue. I have just been only thinking about my church life as this American thing. And Pope Francis comes through and uses language that is very rooted in the fact that he was a Jesuit, right? He was very deeply informed by liberation theology in Latin America. And it also challenged me to actually start reading a lot of these liberation theology
Mhm.
texts and to realize that just because I didn't understand this tradition didn't mean it exists. So I feel like it really forced me to ground myself in this lifelong commitment to being like, okay, what does the global Catholic Church actually look like, right? And
Yeah.
we still have, you and I have written about this and we've talked about this both publicly and privately. We have a lot of criticisms about Pope Francis. He's not this perfect head of the church, but I feel like for me, the intersection of his work and the language he was using along with being able to like have this movement that I was reporting on, that just felt so grounding and beautiful for me in ways that even 10 years later, I'm like, oh, wow, I am so grateful to have been able to cover this movement and Pope Francis and to be able to have like, I've traveled to Mexico to also follow his papal trips. And that has been such a beautiful experience for me.
Yeah. So you mentioned, writing on the movement and
Mhm.
your book, Birth of a Movement, Black Lives Matter in the Catholic Church, still available for purchase. Uh, we'll include the link. But I'm sort of wondering if you can talk about like, what your writing process is and
Mhm.
how your writing connects to your politics and your political work.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. Those are really like beautiful questions, and I'm so grateful that we are have both shared about this because right now my writing is very much in service to the communities that I am from. So a lot of what makes Religion and Revolt in particular, and like working with you on this project, what makes it so powerful for me is that we are both from Black Caribbean New York City communities, and we are committed to figuring out how to get people to think about liberation in a way that makes us feel empowered and proactive. And so much of my writing now is directly connected to my politics. I think when I first started in Catholic media, I was doing the I'm going to be an objective reporter and I'm not going to be political and I'm not going to try to be explicitly critical of anything, even if I'm talking about oppression and these movements. And right now, whenever I'm thinking about writing, whether it's for Religion or Revolt, whether it's for, book work that I'm doing or the reporting that I do for the Bronx, the question I always have is, okay, who is this for? Because I'm very actively trying to not write for white people. I spent so much of my career trying to write for white Catholics in particular and trying to persuade them, trying to persuade them that we matter, trying to persuade them that we're facing oppression and that we're marginalized. And when the pandemic started and I was still doing that, my body really rejected that. And my body was like, this doesn't feel good anymore. Doesn't
What do you mean by that? Like body rejected?
like,
That seems like a really beautiful, there's some like really beautiful imagery there. And
mm-hmm,
I'm just wondering if you can kind of like fill in like what the what the sort of experience was like.
mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
Like I get that.
Yeah, it was like when I first outlined my book, it was very much outlined, and even some of the early chapters that I wrote were very much with, okay, I'm going to provide this sort of Ibrahim Kendi Catholic version for white people of like how to not be racist, because Catholicism means you shouldn't be racist, right? And I wrote so much of the book from that perspective, and I didn't include any of my personal life. All of those personal essays, I was like, these things don't matter because it's all about trying to convince white Catholics that Catholic social teaching connects to the Black Lives Matter movement and that you should take it seriously, and here's how. But then I started writing the week that George Floyd was murdered in lockdown in New York City. And I looked at those early chapters, I looked at that early outline, and it didn't feel good. It didn't feel good. And like, my back was hurting, my stomach was hurting. Like, I was very physically carrying the anxiety of trying to persuade people who ultimately still have to be persuaded. But I was like, that's not really my job. And at that moment, like, I had to really, really listen to my body and really start to connect to, okay, what is my body telling me I should be paying attention to, right? And it was very deeply informed by the material conditions in the Bronx, right? And so my body really, like, I wasn't even eating. When I started writing my book, like, I wasn't even eating. I was so like anxious and stressed, and also actively trying to be like, wait, this book doesn't feel right. So I had to do a lot of like, okay, who am I writing for and why am I writing for this community? And it was still difficult because all that body stuff didn't go away. I wrote this book very much like I lost like 20 pounds the summer I was writing my first book because, again, I was being politicized more deeply in real time and also actively like rewriting all of these chapters. And so it was hard
And
because
also grieving,
yeah, and also
right?
like,
Like that was also a thing too, right? Like there was like
yes.
this sort of I find myself, kind of like I'm the one in the friend group who was like, hey y'all, there was also this like world historical traumatic event backdrop, and then like
Yes.
a very like acute moment, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
a black several like high profile
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
murders of black
Mm-hmm.
people by the
Mm-hmm.
police.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um and like you were working through that
And
as well.
I love that you named that because I was so afraid to write in that grief and write in that anger. Like it was this really profound mix and politicization happening through this grief and through this anger. And I was afraid of it. I was really like, I don't want to sit in this grief and also write a book in this. Like all of those things were really, really hard. But my writing was so deeply at that point grounded in like, okay, I'm writing for a community. Like I had a very specific reader in mind when I finished that book. And so much of the writing that I do now for Religion and Revolt and for Bronx Frontlines, like I am thinking about a specific group of people. I am writing for Black folks, in particular Black immigrants who are living in this country and who are struggling to understand what it means to be Catholic or even be spiritual and faithful. And once that shift happened for me, it became very clear that, like, oh no, this writing is political. You have been in spaces that have tried to sell you this idea of writing having to be objective and removed from our reality. But there's no way to do that, right? There's no way for us as Black people to not write about that grief, to not write about that anger, right? Like we were watching Black people get murdered by the police while the state was also letting people die in New York City, right? Like my community in the Bronx had no doctors in our urgent cares. And then when we did, we'd have to wait in line for hours to be seen. And so being in that, seeing my father, my partner's father, seeing all these people in my community get really sick and think that they were going to die, right? Because it's like this grief, this anger, and you're also confronting your mortality at the hands of the state in real time. And so for me, I felt like I was going a little crazy. And there were moments where I was like, how am I going to survive this? But
Mhm.
allowing myself to be like, no, feel the grief, feel the anger, feel the pain. Don't be disassociated from that. And that allowed me to be unafraid now and being like, my writing process is for my community. And now, granted, the logistical elements of writing are still like chaotic as hell. Like, you know, this firsthand. Sometimes I can think about something and I'm like, this is what I want to say. This is the analysis I'm going to have, and I'm going to do it seamlessly. And then other times I'm literally staring at a Google Doc and I'm just kind of like, what are words? What what are transitions like, but becoming okay with that too, right? Like I said earlier, just becoming okay with your writing process is going to evolve because you are a human who is surviving, right? We're like witnessing genocide. We're witnessing a federal government that refuses to like support us as our ecological crisis is getting worse. So I keep grounding myself in like your writing process can be sustainable, and it's still really, really hard because again, I have my phases where I'm like, you're not a writer if you're not publishing on Bronx Frontlines 4 times a month, or if you're not publishing on Religion Revolt 4 times a month. So being forced to in real time sit in the grief, anger, and pain of that, like that summer of 2020 really forced my writing to be political and in service. I think you said this last week too, like so much of the writing is in service of other people. And that for me, even when everything else doesn't make sense about writing, that is always clear to me.
Yeah, 100%. And that really feels like, I guess, for like the shape of your work.
Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm,
when I think about, the stuff that you've written for Religion and Revolt, um, not just sort of, and well, let me step back and perhaps like, um, you know, I wonder if I can like kind of push back on the framing a little bit because
mm-hmm,
it doesn't feel like sort of, it also feels like yes, for other people, but also um for yourself. And not like in a, in a self-interested, in a sort of selfish way, right?
Mhm,
Um because I do feel like when I read your work, um even when you do have like when you do have a very sort of clear idea marked out, and like an angle and a thesis, there is still also some like searching
mhm,
and like
mhm,
curiosity that like comes out in your writing to me,
mhm.
um that doesn't feel like, yeah, it is, that makes sense, you know what I mean, like there is
Yeah.
also this thing that I feel like you're also, you have a point, you have a perspective, you have like sort of political and rhetorical aims, and also, um, like I'm thinking about, the piece you wrote this summer, about like violence against Black women,
Mhm, mhm,
um, and there was a sort of like really thoughtful grappling about how to do that, how to
mhm,
conceptualize that, how to do that in a
mhm,
way that honors like the sort of complexity of like interpersonal and intra-communal
mhm,
like violence,
mhm,
right? In
mhm,
a way that
mhm,
felt also like you were sort of clarifying something for
mhm.
yourself. I don't know if that makes sense, or if you could speak to that.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And it is, I love how beautifully you described it because it is a searching. It is a searching and also an educational process that is happening to me. A lot of how I was politicized in the summer of 2020, and a lot of how I've been politicized just with like comrades who I organized with in the Bronx. It's this commitment and understanding of like, if you are actively unlearning these systems that have taught us to view the world in a certain way, yes, you can name that, but now you have to educate yourself and constantly be in search of, like, okay, how am I going to understand what it means to be a Black Caribbean immigrant woman who also has the privilege of, like, I was in a very specific space that gave me a lot of access, right? I'm also a lighter skinned Black woman who has a lot of access, right? So a lot of my writing is constantly trying to navigate my own privilege and my own privileged body as I'm doing this work, and also being committed to, like, I'm writing and thinking about Haiti deeply for the first time in the last 2 years. So when I'm writing and thinking about Haiti and Haiti's relationship to the DR, there's always going to be an element of, okay, I'm a student. I am a student who is learning. I'm a student who is searching and trying to understand why I would have been brainwashed to understand this part of the world in a different way. And that for me is what makes it so powerful, because I think I used to overwhelm myself too with wanting to get everything right, wanting to be this perfect, thoughtful, analytical writer. And in reality, I'm very much a student. So much of the writing that I'm doing, so much of the thinking that I'm doing, I'm learning in real time. And I'm like reading these texts in real time. And I'm like searching for something that I also can't fully name, right? I think I, like many Black people who have been displaced from their homelands, right, and who have migrated to the United States, so much of my writing is in search also of this thing that I can't yet fully name. And so I love how you describe that, because that is very much where I am, where it's like I'm writing for my community, but I'm also writing for myself. I'm also writing to have a written record of how my politics and faith are evolving. I think there is also this need to kind of push back against, like, we were both on Twitter at the heyday of like cancel culture, right? So I'm also actively in real time trying to be like, you're not going to get canceled for saying you don't know something if you're doing the work, right? And I want to make other people less afraid to step into that searching, to step into that curiosity. And it's also fun. It's writing now, it's the first time, this working with you in particular on Religion Revolt is the first time that I've been unafraid to be like, yeah, I'm a student. I'm searching. I'm really curious. Sometimes I'm angered about things and I want to write about things in a very specific way, but I'm also learning about things. And I think a lot of that searching that you read is because I'm someone who is a student for the first time. I hated school when I was younger, but now at this point, I'm like, yeah, I'm like, I'm learning about space. I'm learning about liberation theology. I'm learning about Palestine, right? I'm learning about all of these things that I get to do for myself in service of my community, but also because political education is crucial, right? And so I love that. You described that so beautifully. I am really someone who is just always searching, always searching.
Yeah. Um, all right, you touched on, you already know where it's going. You touched on it,
I
and
already know.
I'm so excited. One, I'm so excited that this was like a shared question for
Mhm,
us. And I am like really excited to hear your answer.
mhm, mhm.
So, Olga, why are you always talking about space?
I love it. The Religion and Revolt team really is obsessed with space. For me, it honestly it started with my father, who is very, very obsessed with space, is very obsessed with space, and is very obsessed with aliens. So I grew up in a household, yeah, he like it loves aliens, and he grew up very fascinated with space. He was like this little black kid in the DR, and he talks about how he would like look up at the sky and how he would imagine, the world beyond, right? And so we grew up in a household that like watched X-Files. We watch all these documentaries that are a little cooked now that I'm an adult, right? But all these documentaries about like the
Very
pyramid.
90s baby. Very like watching X-Files.
Like a lot of watching X Files, a lot of like even now I'm still very obsessed with Scully and Mulder. And the X Files has a lot to teach us about our government, but that I'll save that around for another day. Um, so grew up in a household that like my dad watched X Files. He watched a lot of like alien documentaries, right? Watched a lot of things like these conspiracy theorists who were like, the pyramids could only have been built by aliens. Black people could not have built the pyramids, right? So watching a lot of I grew up in a household that really engaged with the more conspiratorial elements of space, but also like had a very deep and profound respect and awe for space. And then it started at some point in the pandemic where I was kind of like stuck at home, and then booked that first like trip to the woods of like in pandemic time. And I'm someone who's like very anxious, very depressed. And so like I was out here doing my nostalgic, like, let me be out in the night air. And I just remember looking up at the stars. And it was, I don't really see stars like this in the Bronx. So I was out somewhere upstate, and I was like seeing all these stars. And you know exactly what I'm talking about, where you're just like looking up and you're thinking, wow, I am such a small speck in this universe, in this galaxy. And something about that just felt so grounding for me and continues to be so grounding for me. There's something about space that just reminds me that human beings are not the center of the world, right? And that feels like very, very beautiful. And also, it's just stunning. Like, I love when there's a full moon, just being outside and staring at the moon. I love staring at the stars. I love like observing the planets because it is something that I am just now again starting to learn about, starting to read about. But you can see it with your eyes and just see something that is like bigger than we have always been. Like the moon has been around for such a long time. So many different human beings have looked up at that same moon, and something about that just feels really beautiful, celestial, and divine. There's just something about space that is just like a direct connection to the divine, especially like Dwayne, I always appreciate that you're always sending me these like NASA images, and I'm just like, how does that exist in the world? Like it's just so much beauty, and there's like a natural order to space and to this part of our galaxy and universe that just feels really, really profound. But unlike you, I am so terrified of actually going up into space, and if I got the opportunity to go up, I would not do it. I would not do it because it also scares me. It like deeply scares me, the idea of like being up there looking down at the earth, having no gravity, like that really trips me up. Like I would be so scared to go up there, but I love it. I think it is such a clear reminder of things have existed before and after us, and they will continue to exist before and after us. And that just feels like, yeah, grounding. I keep returning to grounding, but that's like
Yeah.
what it feels like for me.
Yeah, and there's like a certain amount of like really beautiful irony in
Mm-hmm.
that description of like being grounded in a thing that is expensive and far away.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Speaking of your writing, I would love to like read something about that. I think we got to do
Mm,
like a
we
space session
do. We
because like
do.
there's like this like really interesting tension there
Mm-hmm.
that like you keep returning to grounding
Mm-hmm.
um in that sort of feeling as like the emotional register that you experience
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in like uh yeah there is just like a kind of like beautifully like ironic or beautiful irony in like that just seems like such a far out
Mm-hmm.
um description for something
Mm-hmm.
so big and so foreign.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, we for real we need to do we got to have like the space episode and the space essays.
We have to. We really have to. Where we do like a co-religion and revolt, just gonna like look at the stars from like these
Religion and
huge
Revolt goes to
telescopes.
space is
Yes.
like
Metaphorically, because again, literally, I would be so terrified.
um and so to close the mystery plus one, I am in the midst of like an early midlife crisis, and so a lot of um like um I'm thinking lately a lot about like um I'm thinking a lot about like sort of life stories and but like life stories looking ahead. And so I'm wondering, the sort of mystery question is like, um we're in our mid-30s, so let's say like 50 years from now, like looking back, um like what would feel like a life well lived for you, or like what would you be like really content with if you like imagine yourself looking back in 2073?
Mm.
What like feel good?
Wow. I really, really love that question because I came across this tweet once, or maybe like this TikTok video that was like, I live my life so that like 80-year-old me can look back and be really happy with like the life that she lived. For me, a life well lived will be one where I build a community and like a really strong community in the Bronx, especially amid like gentrification and displacement, but also a life where I spend some time living abroad, and not living abroad in the way that I imagined living abroad years ago, but in, returning back to the DR. Like, I feel like I have been really deeply called to return there and to kind of just see what my life was like for the first like 4 years of my life. And I think a life well lived will include me. I love the Bronx. This will always, always be home, but it's also not home, right? Like most of my family doesn't live here. Most of the people, friends of my family don't live here. So a life well lived will be doing some type of organizing work that allows me to connect with the Bronx and the DR, and I really, really want to spend years just like kind of sitting with the women back on the island and just like listening to them, writing down their stories. um and I think that is, if I were to look back, that would feel very powerful, having like built with and for my community and to like respond to the signs of the time, but also get to just know the women in my family more deeply. I think so much of the trauma work that is required for us to do as we get older requires us to kind of step away and set some hard boundaries. But I have been feeling very, very deeply called to return back there and figure out how I can be of service to my family and community back there. And I think me in 2073 would look back at that and feel really happy. And also that Religion and Revolt grows to be this like really amazing product like multimedia project too. Like that all of these different intersections of my work and life are seamlessly like bonded and in service of other people. So I think that is something um that would feel like a life well lived for me, where I'm kind of like spent decades continuing to be in service of people, but also returning back home. I feel like a deep sense of like a life outside of New York City, a life outside of the United States. So I think that would make 2073 Olga really, really happy.
Yeah, so I didn't know that you felt like that, so much of what we talk about in like our like interpersonal dealings is um we talk a lot about like um sort of the New York that doesn't exist anymore. We talk
Mhm,
about like um being like like kids who grew up in New York.
mhm,
But I didn't realize that you sort of felt um like that sort of like calling to be back in DR.
mhm, mhm. Honestly, I think it's something that I have started to name more fully this year, especially because I am in community with a lot of Dominican comrades now who have a very connected relationship with the DR. And that for me has kind of felt like, oh, okay, in order to write and do authentic work, we can negate what's happening on the island. And we can't negate the fact that that was where I was born. That's where most of my family was born, except for like a few cousins and like my sister. So yeah, it's something that I'm just starting to name now. So I'm grateful for the question because I'm like publicly, I think even publicly, this is like the first time that I've named it where I'm like, I think I gotta go back. I don't know in what capacity. I don't know what work I'm gonna have to do with my therapist to prepare, but I have to go back. It's this, when it's just something that you feel deeply. That is what I have been feeling these like last few months.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And you already know, um, I'm always telling people like, yo, we're done over here. Like, we really are. It's been a good run. It's time to get out of here. It's like
Oh, it's true.
no, but yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Because that's tough. And it's tough to like name publicly between like, you, me, and a few hundred of our closest friends.
Hmm, hmm.
The deep yearnings of your heart. And so like thank you for that
Of
like
course.
honesty and vulnerability.
Hmm.
And also I just want to like thank everyone who is like joining us and watching our conversation, as well as everyone who subscribed to our newsletter and who was like a part of our first reading group. We read some awesome essays from James Baldwin. So yeah, make sure to follow us on social media. Um, we are at religionrevolt.org, and our Twitter is Religion Revolt on Twitter, and Religion in Revolt on Instagram. But there's only one Religion Revolt, so just put that in your in your social media search engine, and you can find us. And see you next year. Thanks for joining us.